This is an overview of the readings for the fourth module in Introduction to Language Documentation and Description, this one on digital recordings and archiving. Some of the topics that are covered include the history of archiving language data, discussion of best practices in creating and archiving digital language data, various views on metadata, how it should be defined and what metadata should be included in a documentation corpus, discussion of the technical and aesthetic quality of recordings, and some discussion of the use of language archives, who are the users, and how should language archives be designed with them in mind. The list of the references. The first is a required reading for discussions in this week, and of the rest of the readings, you're expected to read at least one. This first reading by Henke and Buretz-Croker from 2016 in Language Documentation and Conservation is a history of archiving in linguistics. They give a very helpful, succinct, and clear overview of language archiving going back to the late 19th century. They divide up this history into various periods, some of which overlap. The first period starts with the collection of physical objects and recordings that are based on records and cassettes, analog recordings. In the 1990s, they see a shift in language documentation to a focus on creating language data, not just as an artifact of description, but for documenting data in and of itself, and of doing this more and more in a digital format. They describe the time period from 2000 to 2010 as a time where many linguists were focused on developing best practices for digital archives. And they view the more current period from 2010 until the present as a time where linguists have been reflecting on how to build archives based on participatory models of research as well as language activism. The authors include an incredibly helpful and extensive annotated bibliography covering many works in language documentation on archiving and other topics, so it'd be well worth your time to go through their entire bibliography, to read some of their descriptions, and to get an idea of what of the references in the bibliography might be helpful for you in your assignments for this course or in future research. The authors recognize that there's been significant progress in archiving practices in linguistics, but also point to room for improvement. Quote from the paper: "It has not necessarily been the case that linguists, either individually or collectively, have embraced the need for archiving. Archiving by documentary linguists is still by no means a universal practice. Although the number of linguists for whom archiving is a task undertaken at regular intervals, as opposed to waiting until the end of a project or a career, is growing." The next paper we'll look at is a paper by Bird and Simons, published in Language in 2003. This was an influential paper that was put together as a result of work done by the Open Language Archives community, or OLAC. This paper is primarily focused on the technical and practical problems that make digital language data unstable over time. And they discuss 7 different crucial factors that can make data unusable for future users, or even across users in the same time from one computer to another. They frame discussion around problems in each of these areas with the kind of digital content we create, the values that they want to see put into practice in the way that we create digital data and store it, and then their recommendations for specific practices for language documentation and archiving. Some of the specific recommendations are the importance of using non-proprietary open source software and data formats, the importance of using Unicode or other transparent or interpretable ways of encoding different fonts, the importance of using transparent descriptive markup of data, specifically XML, or programs that are based on this kind of markup, the importance of having clear and consistent metadata across different projects. And they also point to the importance of a search portal, the one which they created called the OLAC repository, which is what the Ethnologue and other websites link to. And that's in order for people to be able to find language data when they're searching online. Here's one quote that explains their emphasis in their paper. Funded documentation projects are usually tied to software versions, file formats, and system configurations having a lifespan of 3 to 5 years. Fortunately, linguists can follow best practices in digital language documentation and description, greatly increasing the likelihood that their work will survive in the long term. This paper by Nathan and Austin, 2004, published in the Journal of Language Documentation and Description, is a discussion of perspectives on metadata in language documentation. They make a distinction between two different kinds of metadata, one which they call thin and the other which they call thick. Thin metadata is information that is attached to a file or a document for cataloging purposes. So you can think of this as an analogy with a library card catalog, or what they call resource discovery. Thick metadata, on the other hand, overlaps with what others have called annotation, and it also brings up the discussion of the overlap between documentation and description that was discussed by Himmelman and others as well. So thick metadata includes transcriptions, annotations, other commentary, and analysis to help understand what is in a particular document or recording. They point out specifically without time-aligned transcription as a type of metadata in their terminology, video and audio recordings, which are of course time-based, become very difficult to search. And even if somebody can find a particular file, if they happen to know what file they're looking for, it's very difficult to search within a file to know what the content is, to know whether that's a relevant file to your research. They also point out to the importance, in their view, of doing this kind of thick metadata or annotation as soon as possible. Because if the metadata is done while still working with the speech community, while still close in time and location to where the recording was done, you'll have better quality annotations. This quote helps summarize their position. It is sometimes argued that the most pressing duty of documenters is to obtain such recordings while it is still possible to do so, noting only the situational metadata, location, speaker, etc., and leaving any analysis to be done later when time and resources permit. We believe that this is incorrect. It is methodologically better to create transcriptions, annotations, and other commentary and analysis, in other words, thick metadata, as early as possible. This paper, also by Nathan, published in 2014 in Language Documentation and Description, discusses ELAR, the Endangered Languages Archive, the one which is associated with the Endangered Languages Documentation Program and hosted at the SOAS Library. The paper introduces some of the thought that went into the ELAR interface design, the design for users to be able to access the archive. The goal behind the design was to make the archive interactive, and it was inspired by what's sometimes called Web 2.0, which is the use of social media and similar platforms to connect people across the internet. The design also features user-friendly browsing of a collection based on metadata, where you can click on a particular topic, the name of a participant, or particular file types in order to filter a collection. The paper also discusses the reasoning behind the access protocols, the 4 different types of access that you can have as an ELAR user, and the importance of setting up the interface in such a way that people can both view material in the browser and also selectively download the files that they might want to work with. Here's a quote from Nathan. A digital documentation archive has to be more than a data repository. It has to find ways to preserve diverse materials and disseminate or publish them to a variety of stakeholders while safeguarding access where required. This paper by Holton that was published in a special issue of Language Documentation and Conservation discusses a particular language archives and how it's being used. Nathan works at the Alaska Native Language Archive, which focuses on the 20 languages of Alaska. The archive is described as a legacy archive, transitioning to more of a digital archive as the use of digital video and audio recording increases. Holton points out that although many archives are conceived of as being by linguists and for linguists, the Alaska Native Language Archive is primarily used by what he calls native speakers of the Alaskan languages. And that many of these users are not primarily seeking linguistic information, but they're seeking other information that's contained in the recordings and documents that are held by the archive, although the archive is also used by academics for linguistics research. Some of the examples that Holton gives of how the archive has been used are of an ethnoastronomist looking for names of stars, which had only been documented specifically in one of the languages of Alaska, but through the archive, this person was able to find names of stars in the other 19 languages of Alaska. Materials from the archive are also used for revitalization of Eyak by the local members of this community. And it's also used by those who continue to speak languages of Alaska, but who are interested in understanding older forms of the language and how it was used in the past. On focusing on different kinds of users, Holton writes, archive users may be interested not only in linguistic applications, but also in non-linguistic information encoded in the linguistic record. Furthermore, users may wish to repurpose linguistic data to create derived linguistic materials for use in language revitalization efforts. This paper from Ines was published in 2010. Ines was working with material that had been collected and archived by a linguist who had since passed away, and was preparing the material for public access. However, it became clear that not all of the material was considered by community members to be appropriate material to be released to the general public. And so Ines began working with the speakers to evaluate what they viewed as sensitive and inappropriate for general release. Ines argues that metadata in a language documentation corpus should include information about the intended audience when the first recording was made, and who might be considered appropriate or inappropriate audiences for a recording. Some of the examples that are given are texts which are considered inappropriate for either men or women to hear, texts that are considered dangerous for religious, spiritual, or ritual reasons that might bring misfortune to hearers, and texts that are time sensitive and that are only meant to be spoken or read in particular seasons of the year. Ines writes, it is clear that linguists should be aware of language ideologies of the speech community and weigh those against the commonly held attitude that all of our data should be made publicly accessible. This final paper in our overview was published by Jukes in 2011 as a chapter in an edited volume. Jukes describes a workflow in which videos of cultural practices are not taken only as data in and of themselves, but are also used as stimulus for ethnographic commentary. Informed speakers are recorded giving commentary while watching recordings of these cultural practices that are considered endangered. The two videos can further be edited together into short films that are enjoyable for community members to watch. Jukes argues that it's important to consider the aesthetic quality of filming because even if this is not considered important to linguists and other specialists, it's of great benefit to non-specialist viewers, including most community members themselves. After looking through videos in a language documentation archive, Jukes comments, having looked at video data from many documentation projects, I think it is fair to say that too often, video for language documentation is produced with little or no regard for the quality of the images, either from an aesthetic or technical viewpoint. And in arguing for the use of editing and creating additional materials out of language documentation videos, Jukes writes, to viewers who are accustomed to watching film and television, and most are, the lack of editing contributes to making much documentary linguistic video all but unwatchable. And this raises a question. Should it be watchable? Some further resources that you might look into if you want to go further in this topic are a special edition of the Language Documentation and Description, Volume 12, that was put out in 2014. And more recently, an online course on archiving for linguistics that was put together called the Archiving for the Future, and that's available for free online.